Hi, and welcome to the 35th installment of the Dad Project. To review, my dad, Samuel M. Purvis III, was born on December 3, 1934, to Myrtle and Sam Purvis. He would forever be known as Pete. He was one of 2,167,636 babies born in the United States that year. Special to my Gammy and Grandpa and a swaddled mystery to most. Dame Judy Dench would be born 6 days later. 2 days before, as my Gammy fought off contractions, Navy would beat Army in the 44th meeting between the two academies on a muddy field in Philadelphia, 3-0. The Great Depression had begun to loosen its stranglehold on the economy beginning in 1933. The unemployment rate hit its high of 25% in 1933, but dropped slowly and remained at 15% in 1940, just before the American involvement in World War II. More ominously, Adolf Hitler's rise to power began in earnest the previous year when on March 23rd, the Reichstag assembled to pass the Enabling Act that gave Hitler dictatorial powers. World reaction was one of concern, but the collection of economically ravaged countries could do nothing to stem Hitler's rise to power. Winston Churchill, among others, had been sounding the alarm about Hitler as early as 1930, but again, with economic issues at home a more pressing problem, they went unheeded. Likewise, the Japanese were spending their fortune to expand their empire throughout the opposite side of the world. This pincer movement of aggression would soon ravage the world, and millions would pay the price. For my father and the millions of other babies born in 1932, this would be the engine that would shape them for better or worse. Their childhood, spent under the shadow of war, would be released following the war to participate in the unusual collusion of 3 human ages that had fomented during the war: the Jet Age, the Atomic Age, and the Space Age. The impact of just one of these ages would have been of major consequence, but the 3 in concert would take my father's generation on a wild ride not seen since. It would be an exciting time, but before we go there, let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
I'm a baby boomer, but why? In 1980, Landon Y. Jones' book, Great Expectations, America and the Baby Boom Generation, was published. On the inside cover of the first paperback edition, it reads, "If you had a hula hoop in the 50s, joined the youth culture in the 60s, discoed, jogged, or got depressed in the 70s, and wonder what the 80s have in store, you're a member of the biggest, brightest, noisiest generation of all time." It goes on to list alternative names for baby boomers: post-war babies, Sputnik generation, Pepsi generation, Love generation, Protest generation, Woodstock generation, and finally, New Age. Whatever the case, he went on for 393 pages to boil down these various facets of this noisy generation, and coined the term baby boomers to neatly package 75 million people born between 1946 and 1964 under one banner. His effort, as you might expect, is not without precedent, and he cites the necessary introduction to generational theory, Karl Mannheim's 1929 essay, The Sociological Problem of Generations, which I read far too much of. I read it all. Like many essays like this, Mannheim kindly wraps up his thoughts in the opening paragraph. He then proceeds to spin it 6 ways to Sunday, and here it is. The problem of generations is important enough to merit serious consideration. It is one of the indispensable guides to an understanding of the structures of social and intellectual movements. Its practical importance becomes clear as soon as one tries to obtain a more exact understanding of the accelerated pace of social change characteristics of our time. Interesting, but more interesting because he wrote this in 1929. So what other generations came before the navel-gazing baby boomers, and what generation does my father belong to? But first, his dad. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was born on February 2, 1904. He was one of the approximately 430,000 babies born that year in the U.S. I have very little doubt that he never knew that he was a member of the Greatest Generation, or the GI generation, or even the World War II generation. Robert Oppenheimer, who would be born a little over 2 months later, probably didn't know either. And unlike the term baby boomer, it wouldn't be a social scientist like Mannheim that coined the term, but an Army general, James Van Fleet, who, commenting to Congress after his service in World War II in Korea, said that the men of the 8th Army are a magnificent lot, and I've always said the greatest generation of Americans we have ever produced. It would be NBC's longtime newscaster Tom Brokaw who would etch the term in the modern lexicon with his book, The Greatest Generation. He would sum up the greatest generation as those that fought and contributed to the war effort not for the fame and recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. There are 2 things I know about my grandfather's time doing the right thing. First, he was disappointed that he had missed out on World War I and would have to watch from the sidelines, as my father would in World War II. So much so that he, like so many others, marched down to the recruiting office following the news of December 7, 1941, to enlist. As a 37-year-old mortgage banker and father of 2, he was thanked profusely and told to go home. But he persisted, and as the war machine began to run out of young bodies, he was finally taken on in November of 1942. He was a 90-day wonder, and because of his age, came out the other side of the 90 days as a Lieutenant JG, not an ensign. Secondly, as he and his shipmates steamed across the Pacific, his ship came under attack by kamikazes. My 10-year-old curiosity had asked him what the scariest thing was for him during the war. Being in a communications unit, he avoided direct fire for the most part, but to my question, he mouthed kamikazes, and his eyes glazed over. I was escorted from the room. That leaves my dad comfortably, and not surprisingly, sandwiched between his father's generation and mine. But what generation would that be? I'll give you several seconds to think it over. 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000. Time's up, and points and props to anyone that said the silent generation. For me, it was so silent that I had never heard of it. Depending on what source you use to define this generation's time frame, it either began in 1925, 1928, or 1929, and ended in either 1942 or 1945. But no matter the time frame, because of the Depression and the war, the birth rates were depressed, and this generation is limited to roughly 50 million members, about 13 million less than the Greatest Generation, and over 20 million less than the baby boomers. Like most generational definitions, the silent generation had several names before a Time magazine article, The Younger Generation, published in 1951, settled the argument with this. The most startling fact about the younger generation is its silence. With some rare exceptions, youth is nowhere near the rostrum. By comparison with the flaming youth of their fathers and mothers, today's younger generation is a still, small flame. It does not issue manifestos, make speeches, or carry posters. It has been called the silent generation. Let's face it though, despite relatively definitive timeframes and definitions of these generations, they can be read like horoscopes. But it's part of a natural tendency to clean up and smooth out the rough edges of history. You don't have a war that kills over 80 million people that doesn't have a significant post-war era, and indeed we did. But what may be most unusual about this period are the 3 ages mentioned earlier. They are noteworthy in their own right, but by running concurrently, their significance was elevated exponentially. My father would be directly involved in all 3, and over the next 3 installments, we will review each. Tonight, we'll start with the Jet Age. The Jet Age. That seems straightforward. It's not. I think from previous discussion on the vagaries of a generation, you can surmise that an age can be just as difficult to define. For example, this one runs on 2 paths, one being a civilian one and the other being a military one, and they are not parallel paths, but very much intertwined. The military jet age is what I've been talking about over the past 34 installments in one way or another, and my dad's involvement in it. But for tonight's installment, we will put that aside and have a go at the civilian side of the jet age. Not to worry though, my dad had his moments on both sides of the coin. The idea of aircraft offering passenger service is nearly as old as aircraft themselves. The first airline originated in St. Petersburg, Florida, when the St. Petersburg-Tampa Airboat Line flew their first scheduled flight on New Year's Day, 1914. 3,000 people gathered to see off a single passenger, Abe File, from St. Petersburg, and 23 minutes later, 3,500 people greeted him as the Benoit Airboat Model 14, number 43, touched down and safely delivered him to Tampa. File had bid $400 at a charity auction for the honor of being that passenger. Fast forward to 1939. The unpressurized DC-3 was plying the skies on regular air routes at about 145 knots between 5,000 to 8,500 feet. It could carry 21 passengers and was doing it at half the price as its contemporaries. But ticket costs were still expensive, and the airlines catered to the businessman and the wealthy. A passenger arriving from their flight in their pajamas was still years in the future. The DC-3, designated the C-47 Dakota, would have a stellar career throughout the war, but the necessity to move heavier payloads brought with it the development of a larger four-engine transports like the DC-4. Toward the end of the war, the Army Air Corps put out an RFP for a pressurized version of the DC-4 that would lead to the DC-6 and Lockheed's Constellation. They would form the backbone of post-war air travel. Boeing would join in with a Stratocruiser that was developed from the B-29. But what does this have to do with the civilian jet age? Everything. The longer World War II dragged on, the more obvious it became to the British that the sun was setting on their empire, and with it the many perks it had enjoyed because of their far-flung empire. So where and how could they compete once the war ended? In 1942, the question should have been, what do we need to do to win this war? How can the Americans help us? But in late December 1942, W.R.D. Perkins, a member of the British Parliament, gave a speech not to ask these questions, but to wonder about post-war aviation. I foresee that, as soon as the armistice comes, there will be a race between the Americans and ourselves to control the airlines of the world. He went on to say that an agreement needed to be reached immediately with the U.S., or the friction could possibly lead to another Boston Tea Party. With the outcome of the war still very much in question, this speech borders on the absurd. But a few short months later, the first of the major war conferences, the Tehran Conference, was held. Most of us have at least a cursory understanding of the wartime and post-war conferences held in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, otherwise known as the Big Three. They were meetings between the Big Three to determine how to wage war on the continent, a final strategy to victory over the Germans and Japan, and finally how to administer a defeated Germany. So Perkins had merely jumped the gun and shed light on a dwindling British Empire that was desperately trying to determine how best to succeed in the post-war years. Juan Trippe and Howard Hughes and Eddie Rickenbacker and Charles Lindbergh were at the forefront of the evolution of the airlines before the war and would be just as involved following the end of the war. Juan Trippe would lead Pan Am, Hughes would buy TWA in 1939, Rickenbacker ran Eastern Airlines, and Lindbergh lent his name to the highest bidder, and in the early 30s that was the Transcontinental Air Transport, or TAT. Three of these are very recognizable names, while TAT not so much. But TAT was one of the precursors to the conglomerates that were to come at the insistence of the Postmaster General, Walter Folger Brown, who would give airmail contracts to larger, politically well-connected airlines. Brown's power came through the Airmail Act of 1930. Have a look at Installment 32 for a more detailed telling of the ins and outs of the Airmail Act. But for our purposes here, it's enough to say that through both the front door and back door shenanigans, the American airline industry was born and would slowly grow throughout the interwar years. The machinations of these characters in the development of the domestic and international air travel are fascinating in and of itself, but far too complicated for our purposes here. Suffice to say, they all needed aircraft. The glut of surplus aircraft following the war would supercharge the American domestic airline industry. The thousands of Douglas C-47 produced during the war were quickly sold as surplus following the war for a flat rate of $50,000, as is where is. Whereas the C-54 was still extensively used by the Army Air Corps following the war, Yet over several hundred were still sold as surplus, with many returning to Douglas to be outfitted as airliners. By the end of the war, the C-54 was rolling off the production line at $250,000 a copy, so it's not hard to imagine the surplus cost was much lower than that. The upshot of these surplus aircraft was that with the extensive upgrades to existing airports, the building of new airports, and thousands of available pilots, the airline industry, as mentioned above, flourished. A quick look at the numbers shows that in 1939 there were 265 planes in the domestic fleet flying 1,876,051 passengers to their destination. In 1947, the number of aircraft in the domestic fleet ballooned to 793 aircraft, delivering 13,189,366 passengers to their destination. But it would be the next generation of aircraft that were being developed toward the end of the war that would put the airline industry into overdrive and greatly expand international air travel. The much larger pressurized cabins of the DC-6 and 7, the Lockheed Constellation, and the Boeing Stratocruiser would soon find the number of transocean air travelers surpassing those on steamships. Oddly, they also put the American aircraft industry on its back foot in the development of a jet-powered airliner. If not for bad luck and misfortune of the de Havilland Comet, the friendly skies very well may have been British. The British paid dearly for their part in World War II. By the end of the war, they were about $42 billion in debt to the U.S. and Canada. They would finally pay off that debt on December 31, 2006, 6 years past due. During the war, because of their limited production capacity, the British would concentrate those resources, for the most part, on fighters and bombers. For transport aircraft, they operated approximately 2,000 C-47s. For heavy transport, they relied on the Avro York, a derivative of the Avro Lancaster. Because of the priority of Lancaster development, very few Yorks were built. Of the 246 produced, most came into service following the war, and as elegant as the Lancaster was, the York was not. As already mentioned, as early as 1942, at least one person in the British government was voicing concerns about how the British would go forward after the war in domestic and international air travel. By March of 1943, the Cabinet of the United Kingdom formed the Brabazon Committee that formalized those concerns. The initial report recommended several wartime aircraft be modified for passenger travel, while new types were developed to fill these roles. The final report recommended 4 types, with A and B variants, for a total of 7 types, to be developed for the expansion of British passenger services in hopes for international sales of those types. The ultimate hope was for a strong British foothold and presence in the international civilian aircraft market. Only 2 aircraft on the list would leave a mark. The Type 2B Vickers Viscount, the first civil turboprop aircraft, of which 445 were built, and the Type 5B that resulted in the de Havilland Dove, of which 544 were produced. However, it would be the Type 4 aircraft that was to be the jet-powered, 100-seat high-speed transport that would be the first aircraft to cut the world in half, as the jet age would soon be promising. British travel journalist Clive Irving mused that, in the popular mind, jets were still demonstrably machines of war. They had manners to match. They were thunderous in sound and left smutty trails behind them. It required a leap of imagination to think that they might be house-trained to the point where they could be used at civilian airports without befouling them and scaring the neighborhood out of its wits. Surprisingly, that lack of imagination weaved its way through the boardrooms of most American airlines of the 40s and 50s. No one wanted to be the first to take the chance on an untested idea, particularly when the likes of the DC-7 and the Constellation were reliable, well-tested workhorses for TWA, Pan Am, and other American carriers. As stodgy as the British can be characterized in film, print, and television, an underlying trait that flows fast and strong on that tiny island is a dogged determination to beat the new into the old. Geoffrey de Havilland was part of the earlier mentioned Brabazon Committee, and with some urging and his own dogged determination, he decided that he was going all in with the proposed Type 4. With the backing of the British Overseas Airway Corporation, BOAC, the Ministry of Supply, and de Havilland's own money, work began in earnest in 1946. It was one thing to design a military fighter that was relatively small with a limited combat radius, but this was to be an airliner that was expected to carry 100 passengers 1,500 miles away at 450 miles an hour at an altitude of 42,000 feet. Everything was new, and some of it not completely understood. It would be one of those gray areas that would be the literal undoing of the comet, but that would come later after a very promising start. After several years of extensive testing, the prototype comet took to the skies in July of 1949. The first passenger flight flown by BOAC took off from London on May 2, 1952, for a trip to Johannesburg. Because of the comet's short legs, unlike today's nonstop flights, fueling stops were still required. The London to Tokyo flight required 9 stops and lasted 36 hours. Flying the same route, Pan Am's DC-6B would arrive 10 hours later. The world was beginning to shrink. On October 29, 2018, and then again on March 10, 2019, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashed, killing all on board. One in the Lion Air livery, the other part of Ethiopian Air. Both aircraft were new. 346 people would die. In 1952, the Air Transport Facts and Figures 13th edition noted that in 1951, there were 1.7 passenger fatalities per 100 million passenger miles. 20 years before, in 1939, that number was 15 fatalities per 100 million passenger miles. 90 and 70 years on, in 2021, there were 0.001 passenger deaths per 100 million passenger miles. Statistically, flying is the safest form of travel ever devised by man. But, and it's a big but, is perception. The passengers on the Lion Air and Ethiopian Air flights were counting on not being part of the deadly end of a fatal lottery ticket. Despite doing very little to move the peg on safety statistics, the perception of 346 people dying in 2 plane crashes in similar circumstances only months apart very nearly completed Boeing's collapse from "if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going" to "if it's Boeing, I ain't going." By all means, read Peter Robinson's Flying Blind, the 737 MAX tragedy and the fall of Boeing, to learn just how precipitous Boeing's fall has been. In 1952, when the de Havilland Comet began passenger service, it would suffer a similar fate that the 737 MAX experienced years later, as the comet flew into unknown skies. Flying well above most weather systems, one variable that could bring down lower flying passenger planes was minimized, but the same pressurized cabin that allowed the comet to fly at altitude would be its undoing. Within a year, 3 comets literally fell out of the sky. The early promise of jet flight and the dominance of British jet aircraft to fulfill that promise were dashed. Eventually, the comet would become the reliable aircraft Geoffrey de Havilland had promised, but not before millions were spent to determine the cause of earlier crashes that took years to resolve. The comet wouldn't fly civilly again until 1958, and by then all its early momentum and promise was gone. Only 114 would be built after numerous orders were canceled. The civilian jet age had stalled, and as the saying goes, one man's misfortune is another man's opportunity. The man in this case would be Boeing. Boeing had not been able to crack the propeller-driven, pressurized long-haul airline market. That belonged to Douglas and Lockheed. Boeing's Stratocruiser was a problematic aircraft that was dogged by reliability and maintenance issues. Boeing only managed to sell and build a paltry 56 Stratocruisers. So, when the jet age was derailed by the comet's misfortune, Boeing, along with Douglas, Convair, and Sud Aviation, among others, did their best to step into the void. Both Boeing's 707 and Douglas's DC-8 would enter service in 1958 and would rise to the top of the heap, with the 707 eventually becoming the poster child for the civilian jet age, the comet an afterthought. The 707's star-studded passenger list, the jet set, for transatlantic flights wouldn't be repeated until Concorde's manifests read like a who's who of entertainers, rock stars, and CEOs. The civilian jet age would and has shrunk the war. The propeller-driven age of the airliners can only now be described as quaint. The deafening thunder of their oil-spewing radial engines something to be read about, not experienced. The military jet age was my dad's playground, his sandbox. The civilian jet age was something he played on the periphery of, just outside the sandbox. Following his decision to resign his commission following his time in Vietnam, he did what many military pilots did and still do. He looked to the airlines for work. That was in 1968, and the airline pilot market was a difficult one to break into. Had he waited a year with the advent of the Boeing 747 and the expansion of air routes that came with it, his flying career might have been completely different. In the Air Transport Association of America Facts and Figures report for 1968, they showed revenue passenger miles just shy of 100 billion for 1967, and it was projected that by 1977, that figure would be around 275 billion revenue passenger miles. Their projection for 1977 was dead on, but that didn't translate to airline pilot jobs in 1968. So, as he received one rejection after another from different airlines and he waited to muster out of the active duty Navy, he flew in a ferry squadron, VRF-32, where, among several types he moved around the country, were two C-54s. These military DC-4s had missed out on being part of the post-war airline boom and had long service lives in the Army Air Corps and then in the Navy as R-5D2s, before my dad delivered them to the Arizona desert in May of 1968. Those would be some of the last flights he'd flew as an active duty pilot. His first stop following his time in the Navy would be at Westinghouse, where he would fly a DC-6B. As mentioned earlier, the DC-6, DC-7, and the Lockheed Constellation would slow the major American carriers from committing to jet aircraft. Westinghouse's DC-6 had begun life in the livery of Pan Am when it was delivered on August 15, 1953, registration November 6105 Charlie, and known as the Clipper Sam Houston and later as the Clipper Nuremberg. It was in this plane that my dad flew his longest flight in a day, 18 hours from Honoria, the Solomon Islands, to Honolulu, with 14 of those hours as first pilot on July 22, 1970. It just goes to show the faith people put in these aircraft to safely carry crew and passengers over vast expanses of ocean. But this DC-6B, once proudly wearing the colors of Pan Am, had become a cast-off because of the civilian jet age. However, in May of 77 and July of 79, my dad would have the rare opportunity to experience and fly the pinnacle of the jet age, Concorde. For more on the DC-6B, have a look at the 15th installment. Like the earlier discussion about the nebulous beginnings of and ends to eras, periods, and ages, the jet age suffers the same blurred edges. Some might say that the civilian jet age began in 1952 with the advent of the Comet, despite its failures. Most, however, and rightly so, begin the timeline in 1958 with the arrival of the 707 and the DC-8. And by 1967, jet aircraft had almost completely replaced piston and turboprop aircraft on scheduled U.S. airlines. But has the jet age truly ended? Some commentators put the end around 1972 when the 747 and other wide bodies had democratized air travel, cutting travel times in half and the social changes that would result. The British and French, however, did their best to cut the world in half again with the introduction of Concorde. Concorde was a brilliant confection of technologies that could outperform all commercial and most military aircraft. Sadly, the British and French misread the tea leaves. The future was the 747, not Concorde. Clyde Irving's earlier reference musing about a jet's bad manners that included the thunderously loud engines would be further complicated by Concorde's sonic boom that would haunt its introduction and seriously limit the airports it could use and the routes it could fly. Despite the demise of the Concorde, I would posit that the jet age hasn't ended, or perhaps in modern parlance, we are due for jet age 2.0. Whatever the case, my dad, as noted earlier, had the rare chance to fly the Concorde from the left seat through the good offices of his friend John Cochran, who at the time was the chief test pilot for the British half of the Concorde program. In 2003, John would be aboard one of the final Concorde flights and was quoted as saying, astutely I might add, "From now on, progress goes sideways, or backwards." Like the Comet, the British with the French had jumped the gun, and I would say that we are still well within the jet age, just a bit sideways. For more on the Concorde, see the 21st installment. In any case, it's been another long one, and I'll end it here. Next time, we'll take a ride through the atomic age. So until then, thanks for joining me for the 35th installment of the Dad Project. And for the 35th time, as many of you already know, I'm telling you the stories I'd hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate you being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.